seated. So this morning, if you can turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 16. While I was praying for a message, this verse in Galatians 2, verse 20 came to mind. And while I was thinking on that, it seemed like the subject gets deeper and deeper and more complex. And I just hope that my prayer is that the Spirit would take the words that are said this morning and translate them into words directly from Him, from God. Galatians 2 verse 20 says, I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless I live. Yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live. Yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. The title of the message this morning is The Crucified Cross-Bearer. And that's an ironic title. Because if you're crucified, then you can't work, right? If you're crucified, then you are immobile. There's no way to move in real life. And yet, the key here is the resurrection. The key is the resurrection. That's the power that we have through Christ that gives the Christian life. Because if it was all about the crucifixion, that's all death. But if there was, but because of the resurrection, there's life, and yet it's very ironic. And this is one thing that was interesting, is that it takes crucifixion, it takes surrender, and then then you have life, and then it takes self-denial, and it takes more cross-bearing. But in the whole thing that gives life to this is the resurrection. That's what gives life. And so, that verse, I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, is a powerful verse. And then it says, the life that I now live in the flesh is not mine, but it's God's. And on April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to, I don't know if I'm saying this right, but Ulysses S. Grant. He was the general for the Union forces. And Robert E. Lee did not wake up one morning and say, you know what, I'm tired of fighting. I'm tired of this. I'm just going to surrender and we're going to be done with it. That's not what he did. But this was after approximately 4 years of fighting. 750,000 soldiers killed, approximately. And lots and lots of destruction. In the South, especially, the economy was in shambles. It was a mess. But Robert E. Lee's, the Army of Northern Virginia, and that army right there was surrounded on all sides. It couldn't go anywhere. Supplies were cut off. There was no other option for them other than certain death, but to surrender. And so on April 9, 1865, they surrendered. And for us, we get into a situation sometimes where surrender, we get to a point where God puts us at the end of our rope. And surrender. We need to surrender. And so we surrender. And that's a good thing to do. But surrender is only the beginning. Just surrendering is not the end of the story. Just surrendering, it's a good step, but it's not the end of the story. So when we surrender to God and we say, okay, God, I have sinned and I need your help, and I commit my life to you. Whatever it takes, I commit my life to you. We can call that crucifixion, or we call that salvation. But in a way, we crucify ourselves, and we surrender. We give ourselves up. But then what happens after that? What happens after that? In in the New Testament, when the Apostle John was living, they had this group of people that believed that the body was evil and the soul could be good. And so your soul, because your soul is good and it wants to be good, it can believe, but your body can do whatever it wants because there's the body is just evil and there's no way to control it. Well, that thinking is still alive and well in our world today. Sometimes, and I think it's a little bit like our Sunday school lesson where Judah had the right sacrifices. And they could sacrifice the right animals at the right time, and the priests could have their hands clean because the soap was top quality, and they could have their coat clean, and they could have they could be washed and clean, and they could offer the sacrifice perfectly. But their heart was not right. And God wanted them to actually have a life that matched what their religion was. And Christ still does. So in Matthew chapter 16 here, verse 21, I'm just going to start in verse 21 here. It's actually the section before where I was wanting to start. But in 21, Jesus was telling his disciples, or from that time forth, began Jesus to show unto his disciples how that he must go into Jerusalem and suffer many things of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and be raised again the third day. Then Peter took him and began to rebuke him, saying, Be it far from thee, Lord, this shall not be unto thee. But he, Jesus, turned and said unto Peter, Get thee behind me, Satan. Or get thee behind me, Satan. Thou art an offense unto me, for thou savorest not the things that be of God, but those that be of men. That word savor means that your mind is tuned towards the things that are of men. Your mind is not tuned towards the things that are of God. And then Jesus says unto his disciples, If any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Notice that the first step is to come after, and then it's to deny yourself, and then it's to take up the cross and follow. Notice that the order there. And in Mark and Luke, it also has the same words or the same thought in the same order. For whosoever, in verse 25, will save his life shall lose it. And whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. For what is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Or what shall a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man shall come in the glory of his Father with his angels. And then he shall reward every man according to his works. Verily I say unto you, there be some standing here which shall not taste of death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. You know, when you think of crucifixions, well, when you think of a cross, you think of a crucifixion, or I do. I think of a crucifixion. And crucifixions were public affairs. They were to kill the worst offenders and to make an example of them. And in the Romans' mind, insurrectionists were bad offenders. And a note, who was an insurrectionist that comes to mind when you think of that? Just in Jesus' time, do you know of one that comes to mind? Judas? Yeah, there was Judas there was, I don't know, not one. He wasn't really a zealot, but he kind of, Barabbas was one. That's who I was thinking of. But Barabbas was one of these. He was a robber. They call him a robber, but he was also, tied in somewhat with these insurrectionists, zealots.
Was his name Simon the Zealot?
There was one of Jesus' disciples of that. Yes, Simon the Zealot. There was a Judas that was a zealot too, but he wasn't part of Jesus' band or Jesus' disciples. So anyway, the Romans, they had their eye on these people because they stirred up the peace and they made havoc, and they were basically terrorists. And so crucifixions were a very public affair, and they were designed to maximize the pain, maximize the torture, maximize the death process so that other people would be deterred from doing the same thing. That was the purpose of the crucifixion. And the Romans and the Greeks actually borrowed this technique from the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians, I guess, were a fairly ancient culture. Jezebel was from Phoenicia, from Sidon there. And they were cruel. The Phoenicians had supposedly originated this practice. Anyway, the Romans it became popular in the Roman affairs to do this. And crucifixion resulted in death. Most of the time. There might have been a few times when the process was interrupted that they survived. But if they left them up there, they did not survive. The one who was crucified was in no position to repeat his offenses. And the idea was that other people would not repeat those offenses either. And so crucifixion was a death process. I'm not sure, when Jesus said the words, I'm not quite sure how to reconcile the phrase bearing his cross that Jesus said before he was crucified. The Gospels were written after Jesus was crucified, so it made sense. I'm not sure in what context that was given to them at that time, but that's how it's recorded that Jesus said that whosoever will follow me needs to deny himself and take up his cross. Now, what comes to your mind when you think of cross-bearing today? We don't know what they thought of, but what comes to your mind today when you think of cross-bearing? You don't have to answer that because it might be a little bit of a trick question. If you look up the word cross in the New Testament, there's two forms. There's a noun form and there's a verb form. The noun form is what it's usually given in Strong's, or the Greek definition there, for the word cross. Take up your cross, the noun form. But then it also says it's directly related to to the verb form. The noun form simply means a instrument of death. It's the cross, that you hang on. That's the noun form. But the verb form is I'll just read that here. The verb form is to cause or make to stand, to establish. To make to stand, like in the presence of others, like before a judge or before a group of people, or before. That is somewhat the form. It's to establish, to make firm. That word is also, it's used a lot in the New Testament when they were established. They stood by. They stood by. They were established. They were standing in place of, standing before. When Jesus was standing before Pilate in front of everybody, he was actually doing the verb form of this Greek word here. That the noun form is derived from. And the thing is, there's a reason, I believe, that denying self is before taking up the cross. Taking up the cross is not a matter of, I broke my leg and now I have to bear this cross today. That it might be to some people. That's how that we have heard that I've got this problem and it's my cross to bear. I've got a broken leg. I've got my truck broke down, or I bit into a rock in my steak, or something odd that causes us pain, that we say, oh, it's just our cross to bear. But how does that apply then if people that are not Christians do the same thing? Is that a cross for them? Because bad things happen to good people, and bad things happen to bad people, in a nutshell. If bad things are the cross to bear, what did Jesus mean when he says, if you follow me, you should deny yourself and take up your cross? Because, I'll leave that question there. But the verb form of this cross is to establish, to cause to stand, to uphold or sustain the authority or force of something. It's like a foundation of a building is another meaning of it. And cross-bearing, then, we could say, is the establishment of our identity with Christ. And that puts a little different slant to it. It's the establishment of our identity with Christ. Self-denial by itself can be exercised without being born again. And we see that in like in military training, for example. There's disciplines, there are rigid schedules, there is intense exercise, there is mental exercises and physical exercises, and some of you understand this a lot better than I do. But the disciplines, oftentimes, they say, extend beyond active duty. Sometimes the disciplines you learn are also applied later. And my wife has an uncle that was in the Air Force, and he still has his routine that he does every day, And he has retired from that a long time ago. Well, quite a while ago. But he still has those disciplines that he does. And I'm not judging at all his state. I'm simply just using that as an example that self-denial and discipline can be done without having an identity with Christ. So cross-bearing then is the establishment of our identity with Christ. It is directly related to denying self, and we could say it's the purpose for self-denial. It's what we live for. And self-denial is a necessary part of cross-bearing. It is a very necessary part. Self-denial simply means to forget or lose sight of one's own interests. And also, another term is to disown oneself. Have you ever disowned yourself? Well, the Bible says that no man ever yet hated himself. So that is maybe the extreme form of it. But self-denial is to deny self, you could say it's crucifying the flesh. That's another way of saying it. Crucifying the flesh. You pin the flesh on the cross. And it's an action that we should do on a daily basis, or hourly, or by the minute, or by the second. Sometimes when we're in an intense struggle, we feel like it's just a never-ending crucifixion. But denying self is voluntary, in the sense that we don't have to do it. But while it's voluntary, we still have to do it in order to follow Christ. And self-denial with cross-bearing also is connected with rejoicing in tribulation. We don't naturally rejoice when we are having problems. I don't. You might be different, but I don't rejoice naturally. And even knowing better, it's hard for me to do that. But it is something when we make the decision to follow Christ, to disown ourselves or to forget our own interests, and to focus on following Christ, and to establish that identity with Christ. And then Jesus says, now don't forget, in Matthew 5, verses 10 through 13, in my own words here, he says that, blessed are you when men will revile you and persecute you, and will talk bad about you, and will throw you into prison. And then it says, rejoice when they do that, and be extremely glad. For great is your reward in heaven. Because they persecuted the prophets that were before you. But the reason you can be extremely glad is because of the identity that you have with me. The prophets before you had the identity with me, and you can have the identity with me, and rejoice in that. Rejoice that your name is written in heaven. There's a correlation between self-denial, building or establishing an identity with Christ, and rejoicing in these tribulations. rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven. James 1, verse 2 says, My brethren, count it all joy when ye fall into diverse or various temptations. Knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. That word temptations there is a time of proving or testing. And it can be temptations, like we think of Satan coming and doing a temptation. It can also be little brother coming along and wiping out your train collection with his hammer. That's one thing that it can be a time of testing. It can also be somebody saying a word against us that is not kind, and we find out about it. And that can throw us for a loop, but it's also a time of testing. And sometimes we are the ones that say words about other people, and that's a time of testing too. There are so many ways that we can be tested, and sometimes we get so tired of all the testing that we say, God, why can't we just have a break? Do you ever say that or think that? Why can't we just have a break? But James says, count it all joy, rejoice, because you have an identity in me. When we are bearing the cross, then self-denial has eternal value. There are times, like we mentioned earlier, that we do self-denial for our own ends. But when we are denying self for the purpose of following Christ, there's eternal value there. Self-denial and discipline on their own have no eternal value. They have physical value, but no eternal value. Another question, can we separate discipleship from cross-bearing? And what I mean by that, sometimes we have the idea, or the practice rather, that we can bear our cross without practicing self-denial. And that is something that I struggle with, honestly. I mean, it's something, I like to have things most comfortable as possible. I like to have things the way I like them, and I like what I like, and yet I still want to be a sincere Christian. But I think sometimes we get things confused, and we're a little more like those Gnostics that John talks about than what we actually want to believe. We want to talk about what it takes, and we can have everything all boxed up and taped up and categorized and labeled and everything, but if we don't ever use it and don't do it, then we are trying to separate cross-bearing and discipleship, the self-denial part, which actually breaks the discipleship act or chain. This tends to create, or many times we try to create the identity without the self-denial. And I think this is what Jesus was talking about when he says that many will say to me in the last day, Lord, Lord, didn't we do this? And Lord, Lord, didn't we do that? And didn't we prophesy in your name? And didn't we do this and that? But Jesus says, well, I don't know you. I don't know you. So there's something that was broken in that chain somewhere. But how can we in our life today practice self-denial and cross-bearing. We all live in this world, and there's things that will happen to us. One of the things, the first thing we need to do is surrender. That's the first thing we need to do. We need to, and maybe we have surrendered, but surrender is actually something that we'd have to do more than once. And surrender, being broken before God, and just allowing Him to speak into our life. And then, sometimes that speaking into our life has us doing things that we really don't want to do. And if we're sensitive to that leading, that's self-denial. And if we do that with a heart of doing this for Christ, that's establishing our identity in Christ, or our identity for Christ. Just a practical way, self-denial, and is just to live within our means. Sometimes we live in a world where we can have anything and everything we want. And there's lots of means, lots of ways to get that. But it's easy for us to get over our head sometimes in acquiring these things. That's one thing that we can easily do in this thing. I discovered that it's a lot easier to borrow money than it is to pay it back. I don't know if you've ever found that out, but it is really easy to borrow money and really hard to pay it back. So that's a real practical means of self-denial, is to just do without and live within our means. Another thing is to be content. Sometimes we can be happy with we can become rich by being content because we don't need so many things anymore. Another thing, a way to practice self-denial, is to rejoice in the troubles that we have. I don't do that very well. But to rejoice in the troubles that we have takes self-denial. It really, really does. Because we like to pity ourselves. I like to pity myself. And when I'm in trouble, I kind of like to have everybody else know that I'm in trouble. And I don't rejoice in the adversity like I should. The focus comes off of that establishing that identity for Christ, and it's more in having people feel sorry for me. Another way to practice self-denial is to praise. Well, it's like rejoicing, but praise, be thankful when things are not going well. Just be thankful. And another one is to accept circumstances. Accepting circumstances sometimes is maybe the first thing towards rejoicing and praising. There's some things we can change, and there's some things we cannot change. The things that we can change, we can work on. But the things that we can't change, we just need to work on accepting those things. There's a man, and self-denial is something that we all think about, sometimes maybe in big things, but the little things in life, we don't do them all. But in Russia, there was a man, Clayton Kratz, was a man that was a relief worker from the U.S., from Pennsylvania. He was born in 1896. In 1920, I think he was 24 years old. But in 1920, the newly formed Mennonite Central Committee, which was a relief organization, sent 3 people over to Ukraine or Russia to see what the needs were there in these Mennonite colonies. There was 2 huge Mennonite colonies over there, and the Red Army there was civil war in Russia at the time, and the Red Army would come in and plunder, and the White Army would come through, and then there was these they call them paramilitary, basically guerrillas, I don't know, that would come through and rob and pillage and terrorize things too. Terrorize these groups, these people. And there was a lot of things, a lot of reasons there. Part of it was that these large Mennonite colonies had done really well for themselves, but they had treated the local Russian population bad. As a rule, not all of them did, but as a rule, that was how the locals felt. And then when this war came along, then they would rob and plunder and take and whatever. Anyway, Clayton Kratz was a 24-year-old American, and there were a couple others as well. There was Arthur Schlegel and Ori Miller. There's 3 men that went over there. Schlegel and Miller were older than Kratz, and they traveled over to Germany, I believe. And it was they traveled to Istanbul, Constantinople at that time. But they traveled over there, and it was decided that Schlegel would stay in Istanbul and organize the relief effort from the States, make sure that those paths were open. And Schlegel and Kratz Miller and Kratz went on to the Malachna colony. All of them were warned that this is dangerous over here. They were all warned that this was it was dangerous. So you're going over here at your own risk. So they went over there. They arrived in Malachna colony as expected. Then they traveled up to there was another one up there. I think it was called Kortitsa. There's another colony that they went up to. And there was fighting up there, and these borders were very fluid. So that the army would fight, they'd have a border, and then the other side would get some victories, and the border would move. And anyway, so they had to come back down to Malachna, and they did their assessment. And Miller went back to Constantinople, and Kratz was told to leave, and he wouldn't leave. He said, no, that would be cowardly for him to leave right now. He's just going to stay. Well, it was a few days later that the Red Army came through and arrested him with some other people, and they let him go. Okay? So they arrested him, they let him go, and then they caught him again. They caught him again, and in his work, I don't know really nobody really knows what happened. They don't know what happened to him to this day. He just disappeared after that. No more. He was no more. He was warned to leave. An American over there with these people fighting. It was a very dangerous place for him to be at the time. And he disappeared. And to this day, nobody knows what happened to him. They do not know. But he was a man who, knowing the dangers, he had told his friends in Indiana that his life he's going to serve the Lord. His life is of no value to him except for what God wants him to do. When it's his time to go, God will take him. If it's his will for him to come back, he'll come back. So he went over there with that mindset. 24 years old, he had his life in front of him, so to speak. Clayton could have, as a normal person, he could have been a businessman. And he could have become wealthy. And he could have, I don't know, he could have done that. Or he could have accomplished something else, or whatever goals are that we have. He could have done that. But in Clayton's life, he gave up his life, we assume, for doing something that he felt God wanted him to do at that time. And basically, that's what we are called to do. Our self-denial, cross-bearing, is to give up our will for what we feel God wants us to do. That might be serving our family. All of us have a mother. And mothers have a job that is nonstop. I'm not a mother, but I observe my wife. And her job is nonstop. It's early morning to late evening to all the time during the day. Mom is always on call. A weekend comes, and weekends for mothers can be worse than middays. And there's a tendency for moms to burn out. And sometimes there are times when us as dads need to have our eyes open and to encourage and to help and to be there. And yet, motherhood is a calling that is very, very necessary for children to grow. There's a lot of opportunities for mothers to influence your children and your family. And then dads, there's things in life that we would like to do, but because of where we are at, maybe God is calling us to something else. There's plenty of opportunity for us to deny ourselves in many areas. And are we willing to do that for the sake of our family, for the sake of Christ, to build God's kingdom? Are we willing to deny ourselves where we need to, where God is calling us to? That is what I'd like to leave with us this morning, is to be willing to establish our identity with Christ, to deny ourselves where the Spirit leads, and to persevere till the end so we can meet Him someday. Let's kneel for prayer.